Chapter 1, Section 9, Biotalk, the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen is a basic building block of plant and animal proteins. It is a nutrient essential to all forms of life. Nitrogen is also required to make deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA is the hereditary material found in all living things. The movement of nitrogen through ecosystems, the soil, and the atmosphere is called the nitrogen cycle. Like carbon, nitrogen moves in a cycle through ecosystems. It passes through food chains and from living things to their environment and back again. Life depends on the cycling of nitrogen. The largest single source of nitrogen is the atmosphere. It is made up of 78% of this colorless, odorless, non-toxic gas. With this much nitrogen available, you would think organisms would have no difficulty getting nitrogen. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Nitrogen gas is a very stable molecule. It reacts only under limited conditions. In order to be useful to organisms, nitrogen must be supplied in another form, the nitrate ion. Let me read this caption. 3 processes are responsible for most of the nitrogen fixation in the biosphere: atmospheric fixation by lightning, biological fixation by certain microbes, and industrial fixation. The enormous energy of lightning breaks nitrogen molecules apart. Only about 5% of the nitrates produced by nitrogen fixation are produced by lightning. The nitrogen cycle is very complex. A simplified description is shown in the diagram on the next page. Well, let's look at it. Okay, we'll get to that. There are 2 ways in which atmospheric nitrogen can be converted into nitrates. The first method is lightning, and the second is bacteria in the soil. The process of converting nitrogen into nitrates is called nitrogen fixation. A small amount of nitrogen is fixed into nitrates by lightning. The energy from lightning causes nitrogen gas to react with oxygen in the air, producing nitrates. The nitrates dissolve in rain, falling to earth and forming surface water. The nitrates dissolve in rain, falling to earth and forming surface water. All right, let me zoom out a little bit so we can see more. The nitrates enter the soil and then move into plants through their roots. Plant cells can use nitrates to make DNA, and they can convert nitrates into amino acids, which they then string together to make proteins. When a plant is consumed by an animal, the animal breaks down the plant proteins into amino acids. The animal can then use the amino acids to make the proteins it needs. Some bacteria are capable of fixing nitrogen. These bacteria provide the vast majority of nitrates found in ecosystems. They are found mostly in soil and in small lumps called nodules on the roots of legumes such as clover, soybeans, peas, and alfalfa. The bacteria provide the plant with a built-in supply of usable nitrogen, while the plant supplies the nitrogen-fixing bacteria with the sugar they need to make the nitrates. So let me zoom in a little bit. The most familiar examples of biotic nitrogen fixing are the root nodules of legumes, which are plants like peas, beans, and clover. Okay, and then let's scroll up a little bit to this diagram. The nitrogen cycle. Okay, so you have feeding. They did talk about lightning. They did talk about waste. Nitrogen in inorganic forms. Okay, So this is something you can take a screenshot of, or you can look at the PDF from the Google Classroom page for biology. All right. Where was I? This plant-bacteria combination usually makes much more nitrate than the plant or bacteria need. The excess moves into the soil, providing a source of nitrogen for other plants. The traditional agricultural practices of rotating crops and mixed plantings of crops, one of which is always a legume, capitalizes on bacterial nitrogen fixation. And we see that because we see cornfields here in Beloit, but then we see them rotated out with soybean fields. So the soybeans would produce some of that nitrogen. I'm sorry, the soil would provide a source of nitrogen. All right. All organisms produce wastes and eventually die. When they do, decomposers break down the nitrogen-containing chemicals in the waste or body into simpler chemicals such as ammonia. Other bacteria convert ammonia into nitrates, and still others convert the nitrates back into nitrates. These bacteria all require oxygen to function. The nitrates then continue the cycle when they are absorbed by plant roots and converted into cell proteins and DNA. Farmers and gardeners who use manure and other decaying matter take advantage of the nitrogen cycle. Soil bacteria convert the decomposing protein in the manure into nitrates. Eventually, the nitrates are absorbed by plants. Denitrification. At various stages in the decay process, denitrifying bacteria can break down into nitrates and At various stages in the decay process, denitrifying bacteria can break down nitrates to nitrates and then nitrates to nitrogen gas. Eventually, the nitrogen gas is released back into the atmosphere. This process is called denitrification and is carried out by bacteria that do not require oxygen. Denitrification ensures the balance between soil nitrates, nitrites, and atmospheric nitrogen and completes the nitrogen cycle. Let's read this caption. A gardening magazine stated, "Grass can actually poison itself as a result of the various chemical processes that occur in the individual grass plants if the grass roots do not have enough air." To what poison is the magazine referring? Okay, so they're talking about the nitrates. All right. Or they're talking about the nitrogen cycle. All right. Where was I? Where were we? Okay, this process is called denitrification and is carried out by bacteria that do not require oxygen. Denitrification ensures the balance between soil nitrates, nitrites, and atmospheric nitrogen and completes the nitrogen cycle. Older lawns often have many denitrifying bacteria. The fact that denitrifying bacteria grow best where there is no oxygen may help explain why people often aerate their lawns early in spring. By exposing the denitrifying bacteria to oxygen, the breakdown of nitrates to nitrogen gas is reduced. Nitrates will then remain in the soil and can be used by the grass to make proteins. The phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is different from the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles because phosphorus is not found. The phosphorus cycle is different from the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles because phosphorus is not found in the atmosphere. Phosphorus is a necessary element in DNA, in many molecules found in living cells, and in the bones of vertebrate animals. Phosphorus tends to cycle in two ways: a long-term cycle involving the rocks of the Earth's crust, and a short-term cycle involving living organisms. In the long cycle, living things divert phosphates from the normal rock cycle. Phosphorus is found in the bedrock in the form of phosphate ions combined with a variety of elements. Phosphates are soluble in water and can also be drawn out of rock as part of the water cycle. Dissolved phosphates can be absorbed by photosynthetic organisms and so pass into food chains. Phosphates eroded from rock are also carried by water from land to rivers and then to the oceans. In the ocean, phosphates are absorbed by algae and other plants where they can enter food chains. Animals use phosphates to make bones and shells. When they die, these hard remains form deposits on the ocean floor. Covered with sediment, the deposits eventually become rock, ready to be brought to the surface again. The cycle can take millions of years to complete. In the short cycle, wastes from living things are recycled by decomposers, which break down wastes in dead tissue and release the phosphates. The short cycle is much more rapid. Rapid. We ended with rapid. Okay, there we go. We left off with rapid. Agriculture and the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. The seeds, leaves, flowers, and fruits of plants all contain valuable nutrients, which is why we eat them. However, as crops are harvested, the valuable nitrogen and phosphorus in these plant body parts are removed and do not return to the field or orchard they came from. This diversion of nitrates and phosphate from their cycles would soon deplete the soil unless the farmer replaced the missing nutrients. Fertilizers are materials used to restore nutrients and increase production from land. In this activity, you investigated the effect fertilizer had on the growth of algae. Some estimates suggest that fertilizers containing nitrogen and phosphates can as much as double yields of cereal crops such as wheat and barley. However, fertilizers must be used responsibly. More is not necessarily better. The accumulation of nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers produces an environmental problem. As spring runoff carries decaying plant matter and fertilizer-rich soil to streams and then lakes, the nutrients allow aquatic plants to grow more rapidly in what is called an algal bloom, or I've also heard it called an algae bloom. When the plants die, bacteria use oxygen from the water to decompose them. Because decomposers flourish in an environment with such an abundant food source, oxygen levels in lakes drop quickly, so fish and other animals may begin to die. Dying animals can only make the problem worse as decomposers begin to recycle the matter from the dead fish, allowing the populations of bacteria to grow even larger and use still more oxygen. Algae are generally thought of as simple aquatic plants that do not have roots, stems, or leaves. A recurring problem in many bodies of water is an algal bloom. An algal bloom is an abnormal increase in the algae in a body of water. The most serious algal blooms are associated with human activities. Algal blooms deplete the water of oxygen and nutrients. In turn, this can kill other species in the water.